Good afternoon and welcome to the Black Press Live. Since the age of 12, Mark Cuban has been a natural businessman, selling garbage bags door to door. The seed was planted, however, early on for what would eventually become long-term success. After graduating from the Indiana University, where he briefly owned the most popular bar in town, Mark Cuban moved to Dallas. After a dispute with an employer who wanted him to clean instead of closing an important deal, Mark created Micro Solutions. We later knew it as CompuServe. And in 1995, Mark and his longtime friend Todd Wagner came up with an internet-based solution to not being able to listen to Hoosiers basketball. That solution was Broadcast.com. Broadcast.com would be sold to Yahoo for $5.6 billion. Since his acquisition of the Dallas Mavericks in 2000, he has overseen the Mavericks competing in the NBA Finals for the first time in franchise history in 2006 and becoming an NBA World Champion, much to my delight, in 2011. They are currently listed as one of Forbes' most valuable franchises in sports. And of course, many also know Mark Cuban from Shark Tank. Welcome to the Black Press, Mark Cuban.
Thanks for having me on, Stacey.
Oh, thank you. And we are joined by our president and CEO, Dr. Benjamin Chavis, and one of our esteemed publishers out of Dallas, Jim Washington.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Mark. On behalf of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, I just want to thank you, Mark Cuban, for speaking directly to Black America through the Black press at a time that our nation is divided by race, by class, by economics, in so many divisive ways. I want to say on behalf of the Black press, we appreciate you taking time to speak about the issues that are facing our nation and our world. So on behalf of the Black press, Mark, thank you very much.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so Mark, we'll jump right into it. I know that Adam Silver took the lead. The NBA commissioner was one of the first sports heads to kind of jump out there and support what's going on with the demonstrations and to denounce police brutality in the African American community. I want you to talk to us a little bit about that, Mark, and what that meant to the league to have the commissioner be almost the first to do it.
I mean, we're proud of them. I mean, we're proud of the NBA. We're proud of our players speaking up. And this just didn't start recently. I mean, it's been something we've been proud of for years. You know, we are only as good and as strong as the communities that support us. And so when the Black community, when the African American community is struggling and feeling pain, we feel that pain as well. And you know, it's just the right thing for us to do, to stand up and speak out, even if it's not popular.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mark, we see the individual players speaking out. LeBron James has been at the forefront of it. One of the things that is often talked about, and the NFL just recently had a mandate, the Rooney Rule, if you will, about hiring African Americans in executive positions and coaches. I looked down the Dallas Mavericks staff, and you got Rolando Blackman and Michael Finley and God Shamrod and all those guys, Shamgod, I should say, and all those guys. How important is that, Mark, to have African Americans in these positions?
Well, it's very important. I mean, look, you know, you want your organization to represent the communities you're in, and that's how you're going to find the very best people, by going out and looking for the best and knowing that, you know, you really have to reflect who you represent. And so it's critically important.
May I?
Yes,
Mark Cuban doesn't know this, but I was sitting on the board of the Dallas Chamber of Commerce when he bought the team. And one of the things they were really, really hot about that I was involved in was this I guess you'd call it declaration of commitment and diversity and all of these things, but nobody knew this guy named Mark Cuban. And CEOs from around the city were going to other CEOs in the city and having them sign a document that basically said their diversity issues were forefront in their minds. And a team went to, I'm not an A source, I'm a B source. I was told this. So they went to see Mark Cuban and they said, we want you to sign this document committing the Mavericks to diversity. And he went, huh? What? And I think you called Tadim Russery at the time. I think the young lady who was over your finance at the time, and several other folks came into the room, and he said, these are senior ranking members of my staff. Why would I have to sign a document? And he didn't.
I don't remember that. I don't remember that.
Mark, I just want you to know that you have no idea about that. So when he says today, after whatever has happened, that still is in play, I think that's a significant statement about the man.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Dr. Chambers.
Yeah, Mark, I know that a lot of our listeners around the country, this is a national broadcast. Just in a few words, how do you see this present moment that we're going through now in America? On the police brutality issue, on the race issue, but more importantly, not today, but also tomorrow. What's the future of America from your perspective?
You know, I pray that it's an inflection point and we look back on 2020 and say this was the first step, not the first step, but the culmination of a lot of steps that platformed us or propelled us to equality and justice for the African American community. That's my hope. And my action items, if you will, are to support those, to continue to protest and to continue to be heard, because and it's not just about supporting the African American community, it really more so in pushing the white community. I mean, the African American community knows exactly what's happened, and the white community doesn't. So it really is incumbent on me and my peers and my friends and people I know to really, help them understand exactly what's going on, so that when we go forward, when it's 20 years from now, my kids are 10, 13, and 16. When they're in their 20s and 30s and 50s, we're not still fighting the same battles. And white people don't still have, I'm not a fan of the term white privilege, but white privilege is not an issue like it is today.
And Mark, you mentioned your children. What's that conversation? We always talk about the conversation in our homes. We have to have these conversations as African Americans for sure. What's that conversation like with your children when they see what's going on?
Well, we took them down. There was a protest march from Dallas Police Headquarters day before yesterday, and we took them down there to see it and to experience and be part of it, and to hear pastors speak, to hear the police department speak, to hear people from Black Lives Matter speak, so they can start to understand. And look, I'm not going to be here and tell you that my kids have the same perspective as any kids. They don't. And so part of what I've been trying to help them understand is, we're very blessed. I told them about the conversations that African-American men that I know have had with their, 13, 15, 16-year-old sons about what to do if you're pulled over by the police, if you're driving, where not to go, not to walk by yourself in communities, even if you know that community, that it's not unusual to be looked up and down and assessed as a threat if you walk into a store. And I've tried to explain to them that that's not something that we have to live through. And that's the differences we, as people who care about this community, have to start to try to change. And that, even as young as they are, they have to start to recognize when they see those traits in their friends and call them out and let them know that, there's the African American community is not as fortunate as we are. And, it's still hard for them to understand in a lot of respects. It's just like it took me a long time to get to this point. But at the same time, I think, we have to do it. I have to do it. My wife and I have to do it.
Mark, there's a rumor. There was a rumor in Dallas that you were considering running for president.
Yeah,
now, I'm not asking you to validate that. I'm just asking you, was that a conversation that you might have had with a person or two?
Oh yeah, I had it with a lot of people actually, and I get a lot of requests all the time, but my family shut it down. The unfortunate reality of politics these days is that it's brutal, right? And it's not something that you want your young kids to go through and have to experience. You want them to be able to enjoy their childhood, to enjoy being 10, 13, and 16, and as they get older. And my wife was just like, no, you can't do it. And so I got voted down 4-1 on that option.
Good enough.
All right. So Mark, Texas is a very important state. Some say it's a red state, some say it's a blue state, some say it's a purple state. How do you see the importance of voting in Texas? but also the importance of the 2020 election across the United States of America?
Obviously in Texas, the urban areas are very blue, and the rural areas or outside urban areas are very red. And so the goal obviously is the 2020 election is to get Joe Biden elected, period, end of story. I mean, I've known Donald Trump for a long time, and put aside how I know him or my experiences with him, we just have to look to see who he is and what he does. And it's very easy to see that the man's got to be moved out of office. And so part of what we'll do with the Mavericks and myself and as many people as I can convince is we'll get out there and we'll support Joe Biden any way we can for the removal of Donald Trump.
It's interesting, Mark. You mentioned that the president is a friend of yours. I was listening not long ago to Howard Stern, the radio personality, say the same thing, and he said that it's not the Donald Trump that he knew. What's different about this Donald Trump for you and the Donald Trump you knew before?
Well, I've known Donald for about 18 years, and I don't even know how many conversations. And one-on-one, he's personable, he's nice. I mean, you can have an enjoyable conversation sitting and talking like this. He's going to be like a good guy and, ask questions, but he can't have an in-depth conversation about anything. I mean, everything is very surface oriented. So, and this is going to sound really bad, but, if you've ever talked to male or female, regardless, if you ever talked to like a model or like a superstar athlete who's just getting through and just always says yes, and wants to ask questions because they don't want to give any answers, that whole stereotype, that's what he's like. He'll ask, how are you? What are you doing? How's business? How's your family? But the minute you try to have any type of conversation with any type of substance whatsoever, he's just not capable of doing it. And beyond that, like our relationship, when he's mad at me for something, he'll tweet about me or whatever. But if he thinks I can help him, I'm his best friend and he'll forget about everything else. And so it's just, he's just not a smart guy. He's personable. He's not bright. And, he's about what's in it for him. And that's just who he is.
Wow, that's quite an indictment.
Right. One of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as these cases of police brutality, have exposed is the degree to which there's so many disparities, so many inequities, the gap is widening, education gap, the economic gap is widening. I see that the stock market went up a record number today, but in a lot of our communities, there's economic despair, there's health despair. As the leader of the Mavericks, one of the major sports entities in America, what's your perspective? What can we do to heal, not just in police brutality? Because to me, the police brutality is a symptom of a larger problem, a larger racial problem in America. From your perspective, Mark, what would you encourage people to be doing, not only to have police reform, but economic justice reform, healthcare reform, education reform, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, there's a lot there, Dr. Chavis. And so talking with police reform, one, in our businesses, we've learned, and the Mavericks have learned hard lessons, that there has to be zero tolerance for harassment and bias. And we put together training programs that say, any type of bias or harassment for any disadvantaged community, that's an immediate reason for termination, period, end of story. And I think the same protocols have got to be put in place for police departments. Now, I'm not a fan of defunding police departments, but I'm a huge fan of disrupting police departments. My orientation as a business person has always been, how can we do it better? How can we do it better? How can we do it better? And can we change the game? And, I think that's the way we have to look at the police departments. How can we disrupt them to get better programs in place, better hiring programs? There's 800,000 active duty police officers. There's 800,000 active physicians, that both require a lot of training. On one hand, we make you go to medical school. On the other hand, we make police officers go to an academy. Some are good, some are bad, right? And there's just a different set of ongoing training requirements. We make the physicians get upgraded and get reestablished with their training all the time because we feel our lives are at stake. Now we have to look at the training of police officers the same way because we've learned over the years that lives truly are at stake. So we also need to improve the training and support mechanisms we have for police officers. There's a thing called 1033 where it makes military equipment available to police officers or to police departments. And I think $6 billion has been spent on military equipment. Well, when you have military equipment, what are you going to do? You're going to act like you're a military organization, and you're going to use the military equipment when you have the opportunity to use it, rather than if you didn't have that opportunity to find other more supportive or compassionate ways. And so, there's so many things that we can do to disrupt policing and police departments. And the good news is a lot of them want to be disrupted. A lot of officers recognize it's a problem, but all these things go to the heart of culture. Again, I learned the hard way with the Mavs. When you have culture, problems, you have to bring in somebody who can demand change and have zero tolerance. And I think that's what we need with police departments now, a zero tolerance environment with better training and better hiring practices. So that's one part. In terms of healing, healing takes time. And I don't know that I can give you a good answer there, but I can tell you that for me, healing can help with hiring. It can be helped by hiring and investing. And that's what I've always tried to do: invest in Black businesses, support Black businesses, support Black and women-owned venture capital funds. And so you'll see me continue, and the Mavericks Foundation continue to invest significantly in Black-owned businesses and help invest in funds which help find Black-owned businesses, typically by younger people, that hopefully can turn into something special. Because if there is a silver lining of this pandemic and civil unrest of 2020, is that there's so much of a reset. There will be 20, 30, 50, who knows how many world-changing companies that will be created during this pandemic. And there's no reason why a lot of them can't emanate from the African-American community.
Mark, has anything over the last period of time, pandemic, unrest, etc., that you would say actually surprised you?
Surprised me, no. In terms of what the African-American community did, surprised me about myself, yes. I think, I speaking as a white person, when nobody wants to think that they're a racist, nobody. And what we tend to do is we tend to, when the topic comes up, it becomes very difficult for white people because we all, and I'm going to generalize, we all try to manufacture equivalency. And what I mean by that is we'll talk about the challenges we've had in our lives. We'll talk about, the people that we know that we've supported, to make it seem like, yes, we understand that the Black community is suffering. We understand they're going through racial profiling. We understand that they're victims of police brutality. But let me tell you, I can commiserate because here's the challenges I've gone through. So I understand, and as a result, I'm colorblind. And it took me a while to realize that being colorblind isn't a positive, it's a negative. Because treating people equally does not mean treating them the same. It means recognizing the differences and the challenges and the problems that each and every one of us has had to go through, but in particular, the Black community has had to go through, and women of color have had to go through, and LGBTQ communities have had to go through. And so it took me a lot, and it took me to this advanced stage to really recognize that being colorblind was not a feature, it was a bug. And I had to really start to realize that treating people equally meant treating them equally with respect, but really recognizing the challenges and the differences that people of color have to go through and have no choice. It's out of their control. And I had to recognize that if I was going to be smart. And in doing so, it really helped my business. If you look at the Mavs, I mean, look, you hate to admit this, but, I had guys who looked like me trying to sell, marketing programs to people of color, or to the Indian community, which is the 6th largest in the country, or to Latina moms, thinking, well, if they were good at marketing, they must be able to sell to anybody, and it really didn't matter if they were white or Black or Indian or Hispanic. And that was just stupid. Once I realized and got help from St. Marshall and others, And I got to realize that when you hire somebody in the community, you know, maybe they don't have the pedigree you might have gotten from somebody else because they just didn't have the opportunities or were held back in different ways, but they have access to different markets and they know how to sell to those markets in ways that the people with the pedigree have no idea and can't even connect to. And once I recognized that and started, you know, conveying that, not just at the Mavs, but all the businesses, you know, and even my potential investments. I mean, there was an investment that came across my desk the other day that was really good, but they wanted to sell to people of color and disadvantaged communities, but they had nobody that was a person of color, you know, in their management. And I was like, no, I can't do this unless you change up your management, because as much as you think you're smart and as much you went to all these fancy schools, you're not going to be able to connect the way you want to and the way you need to connect in order to be successful. And so I learned that being colorblind was not an advantage, it was a disadvantage. And then that being, I don't even know what the opposite of colorblind is in this respect, but really being able to, you know, recognize that when you hire people in the community, they can achieve more than I ever imagined before. And so it took me a while to learn that, but I did.
Yeah, we're talking with Mark Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. Not just the owner of the Mavericks, but he is also a huge business success. And with that success, Mark, you know, there's also some criticism, right? And so one of our viewers, BW Byrne, says that on the show Shark Tank, it seems that Black men and women are never good enough. Can you respond to that?
I don't think that's true at all. You know, at least not from my perspective. I mean, there's been many investments that I've made with people of color, men, women, whatever. I know I haven't done a recent survey because several of the Black-owned businesses that I've invested in just got sold and they did very well. But I know that 48% of the companies I've invested in, not just Shark Tank, but including Shark Tank, which is the majority, because I do so many deals there, 48% were women. And I know that in terms of people of color, it was over 30%, but I don't know what the exact number is recently.
And Mark, I'm sorry, Dr. Chavez, just one other thing, Mark Cuban, why is it so hard for Black-owned businesses to secure funding? What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's access, there's, you know, you just don't know the game, right? Look, when I first got started, I got fired, you mentioned, you know, and I started my first company, Micro Solutions. I was living 6 guys in a 3-bedroom apartment, and I couldn't get funding either because I just didn't know how to do it. You know, I never really had a network of people that were playing that game, right? My parents didn't go to college. My friends were blue collar. You know, it wasn't something I really had access to. And so, you know, and even my second company, I self-funded. And so, you know, I understand that it's difficult to get access to capital, and not knowing the networking makes it much more difficult. But what I would tell you on the flip side of that, you know, my businesses were started with sweat equity, no investors whatsoever when I got started, and they turned out okay. And I think if you're with a business, if you're getting started, you should do everything possible to start without taking money, because I say this all the time. You know, the people who do have access to capital will ask me, should they take it? When you get funding, that's not an accomplishment, that's an obligation. And often that makes it tougher. Now, there's certain business, if you're building a car company, obviously you need capital. If you're manufacturing an expensive product, obviously you need capital. But a lot of great businesses, if not most, you know, Google, Apple, Snapchat, you know, all these tech businesses started without initially raising funding. And then once they got traction, they were able to. And so if you're able to start a company and get traction, chances are the capital will find you. Now, that's not a direct answer to your question. I mean, you know, I don't have an immediate solution to people who can't get the capital when they need it for those examples I gave you, but we're trying to change it. I mean, as I said, I've invested in venture capital firms that do invest in people of color and women of color, but I still think, and I say this to everybody, regardless of their background, if you have a chance to start a company and you can start it without raising capital, that is always the best way to do it, because you retain control of it 100% of the way.
Thank you. That's a good segue. We represent some 230 African-American owned newspapers across the country, many of whom are in Texas and some are right there in Dallas. Mark, does the NBA do business with Black-owned business, particularly Black newspapers? We're negotiating right now with the NFL and Major League Baseball. Can you call on your colleagues? First of all, how do you see the importance of the Black press?
It's critical.
In terms of doing business with the NBA?
Yeah, I mean, look, I just did a 40-question interview with Dorothy Gentry, and Dorothy comes to our games, and we love having her there. You know, it's obviously critical. Newspapers in general, journalism in general, obviously, it's incredibly challenging right now. It's a very difficult industry. The advertising industry right now is hard. Newspapers, getting people to buy newspapers are hard, and so whether, you know, it's just very, very difficult. So where we can support Black-owned publishing, you know, we've always tried to do it as much as we can. And if you need me to say something to Adam, or if I can help in any ways, you know, just let me know.
Yeah, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah,
Jim
so
Austin?
I heard that.
Jim, hey, Mark, Jim is right there in your backyard. The Dallas Weekly, great publisher out there, and so
Mark, they all used to work for me. Dorothy Gentry, everybody, Blair's.
Mark, you know, you're showing that Lawrence O'Brien trophy back there.
Yeah, I'm gonna show off when I do my news.
But you know, you can't walk into an NBA arena today without hearing the latest from the latest hip hop artists, right? Years ago, Public Enemy of Chuck D of Public Enemy talked about spending money, not supporting businesses who don't support the black community. Mm-hmm. So it all ties in together, Mark, and I guess what you were saying too, but I want you to expand on that a little bit. You mentioned your position with the Mavericks is that you do support you know, Black businesses, Black-owned, women-owned businesses. Could you expand on that a little more of what others can do, what the Mavericks are doing, and what others can do, what you would encourage others to do to support Black businesses?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, the first thing you do, you have to walk the walk, right? You've got to go out there and spend. It's not even organizational. It's just you personally. If you're a CEO, if you're a manager, if you're executive, whatever, whoever you are, if you're white, you know, or Black, go and support those businesses. You know, if I was, you know, after the looting hit the West End, I went down there and stood in line at Burger I Am and got a great veggie burger, you know, and some onion rings. I, you know, just did a bunch of interviews with Black-owned media and startups, and, you know, some young kids. Easel Moon, that is starting his own video podcast. And so, you know, and I've tried to do this for a long time. You know, you've got to go out there and live it first so that you understand and you can connect and you see that there's great companies. So you're not doing something that isn't benefiting yourself. You're doing it because, you know, they're great companies to support. And once you have a personal connection to it, it's really easy as a business to say, all right, you know, like with the Mavs, you know, we've made a list of businesses, Black-owned businesses that initially will focus on that were damaged by the looting from some people gone wrong at the protests. And we're going to them first and supporting them as much as we can. Across the board, you know, we just do wherever we can support Black-owned, you know, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses. We try to do it, and we try to recognize that even, you know, helping them isn't just about, okay, let me buy something from you. If we can support them in other ways that make them a better company by offering advice or other types of support, we try to do that as well. And we're not perfect. We've got a long way to go. And the reality is you can't hit every business as much as you try and want to, but we certainly try to do our best.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, back in the 1980s, Major League Baseball got, for lack of a better term, got rid of Marge Schott, the former owner of the Cincinnati Reds. And then most recently, you guys in the NBA had a situation with Donald Sterling of the Clippers. Is there more of that we just don't know about, Mark, that you are concerned about, that the owners are concerned about, that among the ranks, there are still thinkers like Marge Schott and Donald Sterling?
You know, that's a great question. I don't think so, but I don't know. The old school guys, like when I first got in, I was the young guy. That's obviously changed. But a lot of the old school guys that were kind of questionable have died off or sold their teams, and we've gotten, you know, much younger ownership. And so I don't think that's a problem. I haven't seen it. Certainly nothing like we saw with Donald Sterling. But I hope not. I really, really hope not.
And along those lines, Mark, you know, there's been recently this movement by some athletes to get rid of the title owner. I mean, you own the team, but to use that phrase, especially in the NBA, when you have the majority of your players African American, a lot has been made of that. Is that making too much of a situation by saying you shouldn't use the title owner?
Two things there. One, about 6 months ago, I had a conversation with Pharrell about just this very topic. And I went back and I had on all the Mavericks web pages and all my personal web pages at markcuban.com, we changed it from owner to proprietor. Now, I went back and I told Pharrell that he thought proprietor was still too strong a word and still reflective too much of owner. And I couldn't find a better word. So I didn't live up to his standards, but I understood where he was coming from and tried to make that change. But it's hard. Hard's not the right word. It's a pain in the ass when everybody uses the word owner to try to get them to change the terminology. But I did try to at least stand up a little bit and just make that change so that, you know, if and when anybody was ever searching the Mavs website or my website for the term owner, they wouldn't find it. And hopefully, you know, if someday when we talked about it like today, other people might do the same thing. So I don't know. What do you guys think? What's your feeling on the word proprietor?
Jim?
If I'm the owner of the Mavericks, you're probably gonna call me the owner of the Mavericks.
Oh, yeah.
I'm saying that there are very few people who can walk in a person's shoes, who can build what they build, and say at the end of the day, don't call yourself the owner of that. You know, that's I think that's a very personal scenario. And I don't think I'm in a position to tell somebody not to use or not to call yourself what the world recognizes you as. What I would like to ask Mark is that in the aftermath of whatever is going on and all of the things that you see, and you start to hear corporate America really stepping up in many ways, saying they're going to donate this money and they're going to donate that money. I happen to believe that you're going to have to get past a hurdle. And the hurdle is you're going to have to put people with very, very different ideas about the subject matter in a room. And they're going to have to peel back the lemon of history, so to speak, in order to deal with the problem at hand. And I would like to ask Mark, when you sit there and you say, well, gee, you're in the community, you're trying to do what's right, but there are other people who simply just don't see it the same way, i.e., that even the term owner can be misconstrued by people and therefore can stop a conversation. We're at a point right now where we need to have a fairly robust conversation. And I believe that you really can't be too politically correct with what people are saying, because you have to understand the intent from where it's coming from or the background of a person that might use a term or not see it the way that you do. How do you take it from where it is to move it? Because that's a thing that's going to have to happen. You're going to have a protester and a police officer in the same room with totally different ideas about how the world works in order for them to hear each other.
You know, actually, it's got to change where the power is. And that means white people talking to white people, and where black people are at the table, having them inclusive. You know, maybe that didn't sound right, but the reality is the black community has known about this and has lived it and has felt it every minute of your lives. And you've been trying to explain it to us for a long time. This isn't your first effort of trying to make Mark Cuban and people who look like me understand what you've gone through. It's really, you know, I did this Twitter post that, dear white people, you know, it's got to come from us, because we just, when it's so uncomfortable for white people to talk about race, even if if you have a white or black police officer there, and you have a protester there, and you have me, and you have my peers who look like me there, it's very, very difficult to have an honest conversation about race. It's almost like, the old days of business where the work got done in the back room, and the old days of politics, the work got done in the back room. It's gonna have to come, it's gotta come from me. It's gotta come from my peers telling each other, look, here's what we're missing, right? They've been telling us, the Black community's been telling us for generations, and we haven't responded. And look, I mean, I saw this one thing online, and it really resonated with me, where this one Black woman said, you know what, just be glad Black Americans want equality rather than revenge. We're the ones that are missing it. We're the ones that have got to be, not inclusive isn't the right word, but we have to change ourselves, because this is where the power structure is. And if the power structure doesn't change, it's awful hard for anybody else to be to grow into a different position, if that makes sense. If I said it right.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And that's why we're having this dialogue. Quite frankly, when we announced we were going to have Mark Cuban on Black Press USA with the Black Press of America, you'd be surprised. We got emails. Why y'all doing that? Well, we're doing it because we need to have this dialogue. And we want to thank you for having the courage to engage with us, not just for today, but I think there should be an ongoing dialogue. The culture of America is deep seated. And in order to change it, it's going to take not only a dialogue like we're having today, but you're right, power discussions and power changes. I think the dynamics where the democracy itself is better, is stronger when it celebrates its diversity rather than fearing its diversity or trying to demean its diversity.
Without question. Again, it's the lessons I've learned along the way. We've got to explain to people, I've got to explain to people, being colorblind is not a virtue, right? It's part of the problem. It's a roadblock. Manufacturing equivalency is not, positioning yourself as a peer to the Black community. It's putting up a wall so you don't have to dig into the difficult conversations and the difficult understandings. And that's not easy for the white community to do. That's just a fact. No one wants to wake up in the morning saying, you know what, I'm doing it wrong, or we can be doing it better, or the problem isn't theirs, the problem is mine. The problem is ours. And I don't want to get into manufacturing equivalency, but the way I grew up was, my dad and his family was one of only two white families in an all Black neighborhood in Pittsburgh and Heron Hill. And so one of my earliest memories was being there and just getting the talk about, equality. My uncle was a school superintendent outside of Washington, D.C. in the 60s, and wrote a book that was the first history book to incorporate African Americans into the history dialogue, called The Negro in America. And so it was a point of pride with my family that, look, we treat everybody equally. And I always took that as being colorblind. And, over the times that have changed, I've come to learn differently. And for better or worse, the reality is it's only been over the last few years that I've really come to understand it.
Yeah.
I'm specifically talking about the pandemic right now. And what I'm saying is that, has anything that happened changed your mind, or you would see the whole issue of compensating people who are at the lower end of the income spectrum that have become so important to us? I'm talking about nurses. I'm talking about restaurant folks. I'm talking about hourly wages that people, when it's all said and done, if you go back and look at it, you still have to have a dynamic that talks about compensating people who we now know are essential to our lives, a little bit differently than we had in the past.
Yeah, this is different. There's no question about it. The economic impact, and I'll kind of parlay that into one great fear I have right now. I think Dr. Chavis mentioned the stock market being at all-time record highs, or approaching record highs. And what that is going to lead to is CEOs announcing record compensation, record bonuses, hedge fund managers announcing record bonuses. And that's going to make a lot of people mad. And we saw what happened in 2008, 2009 with Occupy Wall Street. That's going to be a walk in the park given where we are today and what is inevitably, if the stock market keeps on going up. And I hate to, hope for the stock market going down, but this leads us to asking some very important questions. Should there be taxes, a windfall profits tax? Should we be having conversations with CEOs about, taking that bonus that probably didn't expect to be record bonuses, but are because of stock compensation, and maybe reallocating that to all the employees? I've suggested this before, that whatever stock related compensation that CEOs and other executives get, then every employee of that public company in particular should get, because one of the challenges are in terms of economic economic inequality, the variance between top and bottom is that if you're getting paid by the hour, if you're getting paid a straight salary, you're always going to fall behind because you don't own any assets that appreciate. And so you can never truly increase your net worth. Yes, you can save, and hopefully you can buy a house and that can increase your net worth. And that's the most direct path for most people. But you're not going to be in a position to buy stocks and buy bonds. And the only way to compensate for that is for the company you work for, whether it's private or public, to give you stock. And it's something I've done in every company that I've started, and every company that I've sold, I've paid out to all the employees of that company. But that's what needs to happen from the CEOs of our big and small companies, for that matter. Even the smallest African-American or white-owned or woman-owned or LGBTQ-owned company, provide your employees with equity, because the key, and to answer your question, we can't grow this economy. We can't become stronger as an economy or as a country unless we change now to supporting from bottom up. The Fed did what they had to do to create liquidity right when this thing hit, when the pandemic hit. I'm fine with that. But now that we've gotten some results, particularly for larger companies, we've seen what's happened in the stock market, which means those companies have opportunities to raise capital. What we're not seeing and we need right now is, again, lifting from the bottom up. It's got to come first from those companies, increasing wages, sharing in the upside via stock and equity, and what other types of remuneration that the CEOs and executives get. And we can also talk about new stimulus payments for the bottom as well. Now, I'm not a fan of universal basic income. I am a fan of caretaker basic income. And what that means is I think it's truly a productive job when you're home taking care of your kids, so that if we gave you $1,000 or $2,000 a month, you don't have to work to make $2,000 a month and immediately pay that to daycare. If you're taking care of a relative, a parent, whoever it may be, who may be disabled or elderly and unable to take care of himself, I'm good with the government giving you payments for that job, because that is a job, particularly for caring for the elderly, because that demographic is growing faster than any demographic in this country. And we don't have a lot of solutions for long-term care, particularly in urban communities. And so being able to have CBI, or caretaker basic income, solves a lot of the problems of how do you put a roof over your head, how do you put food on the table and deal with housing and food insecurities. There's a lot of ways we can conquer those problems through CBI. Now, again, now we also need to look at creating jobs, because we've lost, who knows what the exact number is, because the employment numbers were wrong, but 40 million plus people were unemployed. 21 million, I think, are on unemployment. And according to the Fed a couple of weeks ago, 40% of the people who make the unemployment rate for people making $40,000 or under was 40% during May. And so we're not all of a sudden going to recreate 20 plus million jobs using the good old trickle down impact. Now, I'm going to give you a different answer than I would have given you 6 months ago before this hit, because I'm more for smaller government than bigger government traditionally. But unique times call for unique solutions. And so I think we really, as federal government, need to start using programs like AmeriCorps or even Peace Corps to a certain extent, and hire people, for millions of people, for jobs like tracking and tracing, testing, of the people who are vulnerable. You can tell I've been reading up on this because I got all these stats, right? But 40% of people who are vulnerable to COVID either have pre-existing conditions or are elderly, and they need people to help them. There was a thing in New York that said 60% of people who were just stay at home got sick, and people weren't quite sure why initially, and then they realized it was obvious. When you're stuck at home, and particularly if you're by yourself or you're elderly and you just have an elderly wife or husband or whatever, you're going to need more and more people coming in to bring you things. And the more people that have to bring you things and help you just do things around the house, the more risk you take every time someone new walks into the door. And that's why they were more vulnerable than other communities. And that's also part of the reason why the minority communities were also more vulnerable, because they couldn't afford their own help. They needed to get, pro bono help from the outside. And so what that's leading to, we have to create these millions of jobs, tracking, tracing, testing, elderly support and care for the vulnerable who can't just go outside and go to the grocery store. Those jobs typically are going to go, or can be more geared, I won't say more geared, but will also help support the minority community and reduce the unemployment, because as always, the unemployment in the minority community is far higher than the white community. And we're seeing that extended even more radically currently during the pandemic. You guys have simple questions, and I'm giving you these 2-hour answers. Sorry.
That's quite all right.
No, that's good.
Well, as long as you're answering.
One of the things we talk about government, and that is, I understand the stimulus package. I understand all of that. But I would like to have seen what you just talked about, which is put people back to work. And by doing so, you create the jobs that you just talked about, whether it's Peace Corps, whether it's fixing roads and bridges, whether it's doing the testing or what have you. That might be a better way than sending somebody a check for 6 months, because some of the things that would be funded would be things that would be more eternal, and eternal meaning they would just be more permanent and last longer.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Jim. When you give somebody a job that's productive, there's a multiplier effect, because they're being productive and creating value that in turn creates more value, that because they're creating value and feel good about their job, they feel more confident to go out and spend money because they think that job will be there longer.
Right.
When they're confident to spend money, they spend in their communities, and that helps build their communities.
It's easy. Yeah. A plus B still equals C.
We are with Mark Cuban, the Dallas Mavericks. This is the Black Press Live. We do have a couple of thoughts from our readers, or viewers, I should say. Mark, Tom Costu, and says, hello all the way from Scranton, Pennsylvania. This is Tom, the Cowboy Chef from Babunyas.com. Nice to see you guys. And he plays on our owner discussion. He says, wish everyone knew me as the owner of Babunyas Gourmet Spice. Mark, but a serious question comes from another viewer. It's MT, and I can't pronounce that last name, but that individual says that Alexis Ohanian stepped down from the board of Reddit and encouraged the board to replace him with a person of color. Would you encourage more executives to do the same?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just like I mentioned earlier that I wouldn't make an investment until they got people of color in their management team. It's smart business, particularly for Reddit, because Reddit, well, I shouldn't say particularly. As I understand Reddit, there's not a lot of diverse opinions, or as many diverse opinions as are needed. And, Alexis is a smart guy. I've known him for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Mark, and I want to just to close out another part we had talked about earlier. We talked about the Marge Schatz of the world and the Donald Sterlings of the world. A couple of years ago, I, like so many others, I grew up in New York. I grew up a Knicks fan. I watched in horror. I was actually at a Philadelphia 76er game, and on the screen there in the suite was what was going on at Madison Square Garden with the situation with Charles Oakley and James Dolan. And then couple of months ago, we had another situation with James Dolan that involved the producer and director Spike Lee. And when people see that, and then we're talking about owner, you see where we go with that, right? What was your thoughts? What was your feeling when you saw the incident with Charles Oakley, and then later with the same owner with Spike Lee?
Look, I can't. I know James. He's always been, straight up with me, but he's kind of old school in some respects. I just, I don't, because I know him, I'm not going to, I'd rather dance around this question because I know Charles, and I've had a conversation about this with Charles. I know Spike fairly well, and I had conversations with him about this as well. James handled it differently than I would have handled it. But a lot of it has to do with, you know what? I'm just going to dance around it and say, you know what? James has to make his own decisions.
Okay. I got you. But look, let me ask you this, because the hour is winding down. I'm pleased to report to you, Mark, that across the United States, we have a return of young people to the Black press, our print editions as well as our digital editions. And as I look at all these demonstrations now across America, I'm encouraged. I worked with Dr. King, and I saw how young people changed the civil rights movement. What is your message today, Mark Cuban, to the youth of America, to the millennials, who the future of the country is really in their hands?
Gen Z, millennials, this is an inflection point, and this is an opportunity to change the world, to change this country for the better. And when you have that vision for how things should be, just ask yourself a question: why not me? Why not now? That's my message.
My son said that to me as he kicked me out of the owner's suite. You guys know him?
Yes.
So, Mark, you've got one over there right now.
Good.
Well, Mark, I'm going to ask everybody to cover their ears, and just between you and I, okay? I want you to do me a favor and consider this, okay? Either buy one or both, the New York Knicks and the New York Mets, or one of them at least, okay?
Not going to happen. Sorry, not going to happen.
Wait, Mark, tell him to put that in the category of running for president.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Either one, you flip a coin. Either one, my wife is leaving me. I'll come home, baby. I'm running.
Tell us about that Heroes Celebrity Baseball. Is there a meaning now to that?
Yeah, this is actually a deal that Dirk and I and the Mark Cuban Heroes Center in Dallas put on for years, since 2003. And so we all get together and raise money for the community and the Heroes Center. And so the Mark Cuban Heroes Center is in Oak Cliff, South Dallas, and we put together all kinds of programs. We have career training programs. We have a suit up program where we buy suits for young men in the neighborhood and nice clothing for women in the neighborhood for them to go on interviews, teach them how to go on interviews, try to have other types of educational class. And then we also have athletic programs, but a big part of it is our celebrity baseball game, and that's how we raise money.
Okay. Good enough. Mark, we had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar on this program on Friday, and he obviously was involved in protests from the 1968 Olympics. He knows far too well what these protests mean. When you see athletes, your players and others from other teams and other sports taking a stand like a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, what's your take on that? What's your message?
Yes. What's changed, Kareem had a platform because of who he was and the way media was organized back then. You had your 3 TV stations and, few newspapers, and newspapers were much bigger then, unfortunately, right, guys? But now social media is a platform for all athletes, particularly in the NBA. LeBron, Steph, all the way through Zion, Luka, athletes have a platform today. starting in high school for that matter, even sometimes before high school, where they'll have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and as they get into college, millions and more millions once they get into the NBA. And those people who follow them want to be influenced. They want to hear what they have to say. The whole idea of shut up and dribble is un-American. It's wrong. It's racist. It's just bad in every which shape or form. And so, all of our athletes, regardless of their background or their color, yes, speak up, be authentic to yourself, say what's on your mind, because you can have an influence and you can start to be part of the change.
Well, we have just a couple of minutes left, Mark. There's two people on this call with you and I, Jim Washington and Dr. Ben Chavis. And I'll tell you just briefly, Dr. Chavis is a fighter, right? He's a warrior. He's been through the civil rights wars and everything else, right? So earlier this year, we had Jim Washington on with a gentleman from Dallas, a business from Dallas. And this is Jim Washington for you on air. He cut an ad deal right there.
No, you're trying to set me up.
That's right.
No.
They're coming for you, Mark. I'm just warning you.
Wait.
Already knows.
Mark, with all due respect to what was just said, I have to say that over the years, the power of the black press has eroded in a number of ways for a number of reasons. Those who have stayed close to us start to realize that we have become a conduit to a market that everybody would like to have. And I'm not just talking about the market of money. I'm talking about the market of ideas.
Yep.
And as I have bought the business in Dallas, grew up there, and basically had a number of issues, if you will, that would come along the racial line. It wasn't until that you were at the tipping point that people would say, "Oh, he's got a newspaper. Let's talk to him." All right. And here we are now where
when they need you
how many, I don't know how many papers, Doc, 200, and we reach a number of people. So we do have a command of what's in that market. Now we'll sell you the numbers are there. But when you start talking about where do you go to execute strategy, where do you go to share ideas? I was simply telling the other young man that he had missed an opportunity, Stacy, to use us to further his business. I want to be clear on that.
Okay. Well, you got my email, and so I'm open to a proposal.
Now, I will bring it.
You already know the answer, right? I wouldn't respect you if you didn't.
I know.
Hey, Mark, listen.
Me. My son will be the guy. I'm telling you, he's doing that now.
Mark, listen. Here's the deal. They pay me, so I need to continue to get paid. So I had to, so one day when we're doing this show and it says sponsored by the Dallas Mavericks, it'll be thanks to all of you guys. But Mark Cuban, we really appreciate you. We appreciate you taking out the time. We know that you guys are starting up your season unconventionally, but you're still getting it done. And I have to, on that note, ask you just one more question. I don't know if Dr. Chavis and Jim may have one last question, but we see that the NBA, the NHL have gotten it together pretty quickly. Can you talk a little bit about Major League Baseball and its struggles to get back on the field?
I mean, look, just from the outside in, I'm not a fan of Major League Baseball and how they're run. I tried to buy a team 12 years ago.
Cubs, right?
Let me, right? So I've never been a fan of how they're run. And it comes down to trust, 100% trust. If work doesn't trust management, you're going to have conflict. And obviously, if you can't come to a deal in these types of times that support both sides of the equation, then it's 100% of trust. And so we'll see what they do. I hope they play, but it's unfortunate.
Yeah. Dr. Chavis, Jim.
We've used this young man's time, and he's also given us.
You're calling me a young man, Jim.
My time off camera.
Well, we again, Mark Cuban, we appreciate you taking out the time. Dr. Chavis was having some technical difficulties. I certainly wanted to give our president the last word. I think we don't have you, Dr. Chavis. But Mark Cuban, maybe we'll do it again sometime soon.
Please have me on, Stacey. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. We enjoyed you. Thank you so much. And everybody, tonight, 7 o'clock, we're gonna continue Black Music Appreciation Month. We're gonna have several, I say several, but 3 great artists tonight. So stay tuned, stay well, and stay safe. Have a good one.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Bye now. See ya.